Hello. On behalf of the Urban Institute and the Chronicle of Philanthropy, I want to thank you all who are joining us today for this important conversation we are about to have this afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the 2024 Giving Innovation Summit and to this discussion on the place of pluralism in charitable giving. This is our fourth Giving Innovation Summit. Past topics have included new forms of charitable and philanthropic capital, workplace giving, and the norms and narratives that shape giving. I am Tanae Traylor, Vice President of the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy and the Research to Action Lab here at Urban. First, as we get started, a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online afterwards. Our speaker bios are available online. You can hide captions or adjust settings with the live transcript button. And all participants are muted, but you can type your questions or comments into our Q&A box at any time. There will be an opportunity for questions. Discuss the place of pluralism in charitable and philanthropic giving. As my colleague Benjamin Soskis will share in greater detail shortly, pluralism has long been an ideal commonly invoked to celebrate American civil society generally, and charity and philanthropy in particular. Pluralism has been defined most often in terms of seeing a diversity of causes and perspectives as an inherent good, where have made the case that it is important and urgent to support some causes over others. Our discussion today will deepen this debate to ask what role pluralism does and should play in the charitable and philanthropic sectors. It's an important and relevant topic, and we are grateful to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for their support of this event. Before we begin, I want to take an opportunity to share a bit more about the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy here at Urban. For more than 20 years, the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy has been a critical resource for credible, nonpartisan, and accessible data and insights on nonprofit and philanthropic activity in society. We advance evidence and action to drive social impact with a focus on improving practice, promoting and translating innovation, informing policy, and advancing public understanding. Today's topic of pluralism fits into our longstanding portfolio on charitable giving, which includes research on giving trends, historical insights on giving practices and norms, and tools like our giving dashboard that provides a snapshot of the many ways Americans give. We also develop and share insights on the social sector infrastructure, a body of work that seeks to understand, articulate, and strengthen the support system of our social sector. Additionally, we work with individual foundations and nonprofits to conduct assessments, evaluations, and provide strategic advising. Soon, I'll turn it over to Stacey Palmer, Chief Executive of the Chronicle of Philanthropy, the co-host of this event today, to share a few remarks. After that, my colleague Benjamin Soskis will present his research on charitable cause pluralism from a historical perspective. From there, I'll facilitate, hopefully with better connection, a discussion with our wonderful panelists, and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A. I'd like to thank the incredible Urban team, including Ben and Laura Tomasco, Hannah Martin, Leah St. John, and our communications team for their hard work to prepare this event today. Thank you for joining us, and I'd like to welcome Stacey Palmer.
Thanks so much, Tenny, and thanks to all of your colleagues who have been such great partners in putting together this essential conversation, and welcome to all of you in the audience. We all know how important it is for philanthropy to grapple with the role pluralism plays today. Concerns about hyperpolarization have alarmed many in philanthropy, prompting a group of leaders of varying ideologies to come together last year to write an essay in the Chronicle calling on the field to embrace pluralism and engage opposing viewpoints constructively. Two of those authors are here today, as are some prominent experts who have strong critiques of that call. Such opportunities to discuss differences in thoughtful and open ways are all too rare in philanthropy. And that's why the Chronicle has started a new project called The Commons to help philanthropy figure out its role in working across divides. We're eager to highlight solutions, offer research on where philanthropy can make a difference, and explain where it's getting in the way. We hope today's discussion, which is part of The Commons, will inspire you to think more deeply about these issues, and we hope you'll let us know how we can advance your work to help communities come together to get things done. I can think of nobody better to frame these issues than Ben Soskus, a historian and Urban Institute scholar who contributes regularly to the Chronicle of Philanthropy. Ben, will you tell us about the work you've been doing to understand the place of pluralism in philanthropy throughout history, and especially in this past decade?
Thanks so much, Stacy. I'd be glad to, in fact. So we are here to speak about pluralism and its place in charitable and philanthropic giving. I think it's safe to say that that place is now a complicated one. Why? Well, for much of the last century, pluralism was celebrated as perhaps the primary value that defined American civil society and that united Americans in that celebration. Today, for a substantial number of people, that's still the case. But it's not so for many others. Pluralism is still a central value. Its roots still reach deep in the soil of civil society, but it's increasingly a contested one. So how did we get to this point? In my time with you today, I want to try to answer that question, in part by making use of research that informed a report I wrote and that Urban published last fall. I'm going to give an overview of pluralism's deep roots within the charitable and philanthropic realms, and then provide some historical context for how its meaning and status have been recently challenged. But first, let's start with some provisional definitions. When we talk about pluralism in any realm, we generally mean a belief that a diverse range or assortment of things, be they interests or values or causes or whatever, is an essential characteristic of the system, and even an intrinsic good within it. So what might this mean with respect to charitable or philanthropic giving? It can mean a bunch of things, and it's important to note that those who invoke the term are not always clear about which one of them they are adopting. First, you can talk about pluralism between causes, the belief that it's an intrinsic good within the sector that people give to a broad range of causes. There's also pluralism within a cause, the belief that it's an essential condition or an intrinsic good that, given any cause, there are a multitude of approaches and perspectives on how to address it. You can talk about a pluralism with respect to giving approaches or styles or modalities. But there's also a broader conception of pluralism, which can be understood less in terms of specific giving decisions or approaches than as a condition of civil society more generally that charitable or philanthropic giving can take responsibility for. Another way to think of this is, given the multitude of causes or approaches that the vast range of givers support, pluralism is the constellation of beliefs dedicated to managing and nurturing that condition of plurality. When people invoke pluralism in this way, they are often speaking about a set of norms governing the exchange of divergent viewpoints, one that, in a sense, legitimizes that divergence. And it often shades into discussions of civility and civil discourse and the exchange of conflicting ideas, and what role should philanthropy play, if any, in promoting them. So if those are some of the main ways that pluralism is understood with respect to charitable and philanthropic giving, we can begin to understand those deep historic roots I mentioned. I want to highlight a few major strands of those roots now. The first is the development of the legal frameworks that govern charitable giving in the US, especially at the federal level. Basically, charity law does very little to define what charity is or should be. It insists on a public benefit and makes use of very broad categories, putting forward enumerations of them to set out the bounds of the charitable, without any sort of ranking or prioritization among them. And this lack of a single uniform standard, with its implicit premise that there are multiple approaches to conceptualizing the public good, has fostered pluralism. The second factor is the influence of pluralism in other domains, for instance, in political and especially religious life. Religious pluralism started out as a recognition of the religious diversity that defined the US in its earliest years, a way to avoid the violent sectarian conflicts that had ravaged Europe. But as it developed over time, by the mid-20th century, it took on a more affirmative cast, asserting that diversity of religious beliefs and traditions, was itself a positive good and an essentially American characteristic. This nation was harboring different vital ways of apprehending the ultimate reality. Religious pluralism was not only a model for charitable pluralism, it was also an engine for it, since religious institutions have long been the largest recipient of charitable dollars. Finally, charitable pluralism was strengthened through the set of norms that emerged out of and helped to guide the growth of large-scale philanthropy at the turn of the 20th century. Core to this development, and it's still very much with us today, was the belief that donors should be guided by the particularities of their interests, passions, experience, and talents. That there was a strong expressive component to giving that was linked to the good it could do. As Andrew Carnegie declared in his Gospel of Wealth, and I'm contractually obligated to mention the Gospel of Wealth in every public event I participate in, quote, "It is not expected, neither is it desirable, that there should be general concurrence as to the best possible use of surplus wealth. For different men and different localities, there are different uses. What commends itself most highly to the judgment of the administrator is the best use for him, for his heart should be in the work." This became the mantra for individual donors, and large and small scale, and for private foundations. To quote a charity researcher in 1921, "If all citizens gave by exercising their, quote, independent judgment, it would harness the intelligence of the whole heterogeneous variety of American minds for the public good." This approach was, in a sense, endorsed by a burgeoning fundraising profession, which embraced that heterogeneity, focusing largely on raising more dollars on the aggregate total of the whole, and less on precisely where or how those funds were dispersed. And this focus on more also provided more ground for pluralism to take root. And so, though pluralism was not without its early challenges, by the second half of the last century, it really was the dominant value within the charitable and philanthropic sectors. It received another boost in the waning years of the Cold War, and then with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, with widespread celebration of civil society as the bedrock of a liberal polity, distinguishing free from authoritarian states. Pluralism, set against totalitarian monism, which pushed one single approach or cause, was held up as an essential component of this civil society. It also served as a unifying principle to promote the consolidation of a nonprofit sector. It was, for instance, championed by those who created a dependent sector. It was an ideal that, at least in general terms, could unite the left and the right. For the left, pluralism could signal the need to draw attention to underfunded and marginalized communities. And for a surging conservative movement within philanthropy, pluralism represented a bulwark against the imposition of orthodoxies on civil society, whether they originated from the state or from establishment private actors. In this way, pluralism became, and is still very much, championed as a guarantor of donor choice and donor freedom. By the end of the century, the massive rise in concentrated wealth and the emergence of a new core of engaged living mega donors also boosted the status of pluralism. With all that money out there were strong incentives to focus on directing as much of it as possible to charitable and philanthropic ends without interfering with donor prerogatives and prescribing where or how donors should be directed. Think for a moment of all those donor rankings that proliferated, which largely features aggregate dollar numbers with the implicit premise that more was better wherever directed. So without getting into more detail, we can state that the power of charitable and philanthropic pluralism at the turn of this last century was very strong. In fact, we can say that's when it actually reached its peak. Because around that time, we also begin seeing more explicit challenges to pluralism as a consensus ideal in the sector, which would eventually diminish that status. In my report, I focus on a particular subspecies of those challenges, what I call a prescriptive turn in charitable discourse, which meant a greater license to assert publicly that some causes or approaches are more worthy of support than others, and that individuals or institutions should change their giving practices accordingly. I discuss two examples in particular, which aren't often viewed as aligned, but which I saw as united in the challenge they posed to the uncontested status of pluralism as a consensus value, the effective altruist movement, and the push for racial equity grantmaking. I want to briefly explore a few of the dynamics behind the challenge to pluralism now. First, a consolidated nonprofit sector led to improved data about giving, which also meant more of an understanding of giving gaps and existing disparities within a pluralistic framework. Relatedly, the rise of equity as a primary consideration for many within the sector helped to erode the presumption towards cause agnosticism, in which a gift should be appreciated in isolation as the expression of a donor's prerogatives. Donations were increasingly understood in the context of giving in the aggregate, with a gift assessed in relation to the allocation of charitable resources more generally. And this led to more calls that given a particular distribution of resources, the next dollar should be directed to an underfunded but essential cause, and should therefore be withheld from, quote, rival cause areas. There was also the prevailing sense of a mounting crisis or mounting crises, ecological, economic, or those related to racial justice, which also led to a challenge to pluralism and a licensing of prescription if pluralism and a deference to donor prerogatives was understood as contributing to a lack of funding to these crises, commensurate with their urgency and severity. Overall, I think there has also been a shift in norms endorsing the scrutinization of giving decisions, the legitimation of critical attention directed at both the individual and institutional level, and a proliferation of platforms, publications, and venues from which to stage these critiques, which again has provided more grounds for a challenge to pluralism. In researching these challenges to pluralism, one thing that was really striking to me was that when many of them were first emerged, they were perceived as a sort of injury by some donors, as a kind of moral affront, a violation of clearly established interpersonal norms. I think that degree of grievance has subsided a bit, but I still think it's there under the surface. And it's made the status of charitable and philanthropic pluralism and the question of how pluralism impacts the norms that shape how we give and think about giving always volatile. This is especially the case with respect to the final factor behind the increased challenge to pluralism status as a consensus value for the charitable and philanthropic sectors, and arguably the most significant one, the increased polarization of US society combined with the growth of high-profile, explicitly political or policy-oriented giving. Leaders within charitable giving and philanthropy have long maintained a pose as unifying forces in American society, standing somehow above or outside its main divisions. But that posture has increasingly been called into question, as charity and philanthropy are often perceived as reflections of those divisions within our common life. That does not, in and of itself, necessarily represent a challenge to pluralism, but it can be, and it does raise important questions about how charitable giving and philanthropy should relate to these divisions. Does maintaining a commitment to a pluralistic civil society mean helping to secure the space and the norms for the adjudication of these differences? Or must a donor's role as an active combatant within those contests take precedence? I have the relatively easy job of laying out these questions and explaining how they have come to the fore in recent years. Our tremendous panelists have the much more difficult job of taking these questions on. So with that background, I will pass things on to my colleague, Tanae Traylor, who will moderate what I know will be a fascinating discussion. So thanks so much to you all, and over to you, Tanae.
Thank you, Ben. So fascinating. And we're here to talk about pluralism, and we're going to go deeper as it relates to charitable and philanthropic giving. As Ben outlined in his remarks and in his research report, it's an ideal with deep roots. For many years, pluralism was invoked as one of the essential conditions of American civil society that allowed giving to thrive. It was an ideal embraced across the ideological spectrum by conservatives and progressives within philanthropy. That seems no longer to be the case. It's now increasingly clear that there are a range of different attitudes toward and interpretations of pluralism. For some, it continues to be a value that must be championed, and for others, it's much more problematic. Today, we're going to explore those differences together. We're going to look at what pluralism means in the charitable and philanthropic giving sectors, what its value might be to the work, what its relationship might be to equity, and what dangers might come from its promotion alongside benefits. These are all big questions, but we have assembled a fantastic team of folks who you all know have thought very deeply on this topic, and we're going to dig in. And throughout the discussion, please remember to engage. Type your questions or comments in the Q&A box. As we begin, please allow me to introduce this outstanding panel, and I'll ask you all to join us on screen as I say your names. Lori Villarosa, founder and executive director of the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, CREE. Hillary Pennington, executive vice president of programs at the Ford Foundation. Brian Hook, chairman and CEO of Stand Together. Sam Gill, president and CEO of the Doris Duke Foundation. Last but definitely not least, Aisha Alexander Young, managing director at Frontline Solutions. I wish we were all in person so everyone can give you all a round of applause for giving your time today, but maybe we'll wait to the end and we'll give a virtual round of applause. So let's begin. We're going to start with the basics. Hillary, in your role at the Ford Foundation, when you hear pluralism, or when you yourself use it with respect to charitable giving and philanthropy, what does it mean to you? And Brian, how about you in your work with Stand Together? So first Hillary, and then we'll jump to Brian.
Okay, well, thanks, Tanae. And for me, my favorite definition of pluralism is from the Pop Culture Collaborative, which essentially defines it as a verb. And they say, pluralism is not primarily defined by our values, but by how we behave in relation to our values. It's both the valuing of difference and the active forging of bonds across our differences, a condition in which the majority of people in a community or a nation are actively engaged in the work of belonging together in a just society. So I'd say pluralism is central to the unfinished project of American democracy, and it's really important in relation to philanthropy. To me, it does not mean that we are justified in funding any kind of project or activity. It does not mean anything goes. My fellow panelists and I may not always agree on our vision of what is good or just, but we do know that we have to behave in relation to a set of values about the norms and rules that keep a society healthy. Because philanthropy is a vital norm keeper at a time when other norm keepers are dropping the ball. And this is especially important now, as we've talked about, because both civil society and philanthropy have been caught on the back foot by organized forces working to advance division and foster polarization. And polarization of the kind we're experiencing now in the US does not appear naturally. It is a political project, largely promoted by conflict entrepreneurs who understand how to activate binary us-them thinking in order to distract from solving problems in moments of uncertainty. And we are living at a time of uncertainty. It will not go away when every one of our major systems and paradigms is under siege. because they were not built to fit the kinds of challenges we face or the world we need to build. So we have to get better at identifying in advance what will be major causes of uncertainty, climate change, conflict, pandemics, migration, and to prepare the people working on these issues to anticipate polarization and know how to mitigate it. In a way, you could see polarization as a hyper problem that prevents progress on all the other problems that we in philanthropy are trying to solve. And I think we have to both get smarter at how to work on it, but also to make sure that we in philanthropy do not ourselves inadvertently contribute to making polarization worse. So just a couple points in wrapping up. It's interesting to me that in the US, combating polarization often gets heard as both sidism or kind of bridging towards the lowest common denominator. But the grantees Ford is working with teach us that navigating polarization requires entering the work, holding our values firmly. And this is a discipline. We need to seek not to convince the other, but to understand them, not to cave, but to find the first small action we can take together in order to build the trust we need to take the next bigger one. And I think this is especially important when you work as Ford, and many of us do, on issues of social justice. We are not neutral. We see clear inequities and injustices that are wrong, and we seek to change those in order to transform society so that they work for all of us. But while we should not be neutral, we are learning that how we work matters as much as what we work on. And I think too often we and our grantees can fall into the trap and the language about winning the fight, or and we can move from there to creating an enemy other. And this is dangerous because, as our grantees in contexts outside the US have taught us at Ford, the methods you use to reduce or recover from polarization determine the kind of victory or peace or pluralistic society you'll have. So I'll stop there, but those are opening comments.
Brian?
Well, thank you, Tanae, and thanks to you and Stacy for hosting this. I'm hoping that this is a great illustration of the value of pluralism. We certainly have a great set of people, and I expect it will be a good discussion because of the diversity of perspectives. And I agree with a lot of what Hillary just said. In fact, all of what Hillary just said. I thought it was a great way to start off. We'll do a lot of talking, I think, today about what pluralism means, and that's important. But ultimately, the test of a pluralistic society is our behavior. But it's useful for me to start with kind of the basics, as Hillary did. To me, pluralism is an essential element of a free and open society, a society where we can live well together. And it's basic at the same time as it's profound. So I think about pluralism as a set of principles and practices that enable a diverse people to live well together, to live in peace together. And when I say that, it does sound pretty basic, I think pretty benign almost. But in fact, to me, it's very profound because if you consider the alternative, how do people with diverse perspectives or diverse ideas live well or live together outside of pluralism? The answer is often violence and conquering. And as Hillary points out, that is the trend that we're seeing in so many of our institutions now, is that the way that you deal with people who you don't like or who are different from you, who offer ideas that might threaten your status or how you think we ought to live, is through ad hominem attacks bordering on violence. People on this call and in the audience, I think, probably know this literature better than most, but a frightening number of Americans today on both sort of sides of the extremes will talk about how violence is justified to deal with those whose political ideas are different from theirs, just as an example. And so I think it's really important that we have this conversation about philanthropy to make sure that philanthropy doesn't head in the same direction as so many of these institutions. But to get very concrete, how does pluralism actually, the ideal actually affect the way that we do our work at Stand Together? Well, in a sense, pluralism is baked into Stand Together. It's sort of in our bones. We call ourselves Stand Together. It's the idea that we can accomplish a whole lot more on the problems that we try to address in society by working with others rather than trying to go it alone. And what we've tried to do is sort of bake into our work this expectation that we are stronger because of our differences, not in spite of them. And so some examples of that very briefly, when we're thinking about how best to accomplish a goal or to address a social issue or an issue of societal injustice or social change, We seek rigorous challenge from those who have different ideas from us. And in that challenge, we often learn something, and we often find alliance or common cause to kind of build a coalition of people who can get things done. And to my study, that's the way that you make big changes happen. And so this notion of sort of a presupposition of pluralism, the idea that everyone has dignity and everyone should have the right to be heard, is critical. I want to just echo what Hillary said. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about what that means in practice. It is not a moral equivocation. It's not a sort of moral relativism where injustice gets a pass. Far from it. But it is an expectation that people will have the ability to voice their ideas, and their ideas should live and die based on the results that they produce in people's lives.
Well, first, I'm just already excited about this conversation. Let me just say this. Brian, your note around the test of a pluralistic society is our behavior. Very powerful note. And Hillary, for you, that philanthropy is a vital norm keeper. Really important. And I think are great launch pads as we continue to talk to our other panelists. So thank you all so much. Let's move to Aisha. Aisha, I'm going to quote something you wrote on your social media recently. You wrote that you were excited to share your point of view on pluralism, what it can be and what it is not. I promise we'll get to that last part. But can you tell us, when it comes to your work in charitable and philanthropic giving at Frontline and in your past roles, what is your take on pluralism? What is it? And what can it be? How does it practically show up in your day-to-day work? And then I'll ask the same question to Sam about his work at Doris Duke.
Sure, thank you, Tanae. So I think just starting out, my definition of pluralism is not very different at all from what we heard from Brian and Hillary. I think one thing that I would call out as being distinct, though, right, is that pluralism is based upon a shared social contract and a shared sense of our common humanity, right? And I think those things are really core to the concept. When we think about philanthropy, at its root, it means love for humanity. And so when I think about the work that I have done across the philanthropic sector, really pluralism is a aspirational state, right? And the reason I call it aspirational is because that aspiration has to be based upon that central notion that of a social contract that centers humanity and liberty and justice for all. And we can't make qualifiers for that all. It has to be extended to everyone. And so in many ways that has been kind of the direct tension is that, we're advancing pluralism in the name of a shared social contract. We have to have a shared social contract that accepts us all and prioritizes us all. And so that has to mean everyone, not a privileged few. The idea of plurality is to make sure that the voices of the most marginalized can be heard in the public square, right? That's why it's the public square. It doesn't require barriers to entry like philanthropy has, right? We are a institution in the ivory tower that creates barriers for our grantees and partners every single day. But the public square is one that is without barriers and invites the most marginalized voices among us to be able to be heard. And so I really think of pluralism that way, as an aspiration. And at Frontline, we really want to make sure that we are working with funders, and across my career, wanted to work for funders that are really explicit and grappling honestly with the historical and prevailing context that wealthy people have power and foundations hold a disproportionate amount of power and operate within an inherently inequitable system that causes harm, right? And so where power and resources are hoarded, that is the enemy of plurality. It's actually paternalism. And so my hope is that pluralism, a true sense of pluralism, is one that requires transforming the role of funders within the public square towards redistributing power and resources so that community visions that are intended to be centered are able to advance and move forward. And we are able to survive, again, together based on that shared humanity and that shared sense of a social contract. I think I'll stop there.
Damn.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Tanae and Urban, for having me and eager to be a part of this conversation. I mean, I certainly agree, as we all have. There's very little pluralism in this call. We all agree with the foregoing. But you know, when I think about how we advance pluralism, principally in our work at Doris Duke Foundation, I'm rooted in, I think, the way Ben really effectively captured the different justifications for pluralism and philanthropy. So one is sort of the negative argument, right? It's Doris Duke's wealth. And so she is in essence manifesting her conscience through the foundation, and therefore it is to fund her interests that the foundation is organized. And then the affirmative argument that society benefits from an interplay of diverse ideas. And we take that argument seriously too, that we have something distinctive to add to discussions about important issues that in this case is Doris Duke's interest. So I'll give a couple examples of this. Doris Duke was really interested in performing artists and how performing artists were doing. And so we as a foundation really focus all of our investments in the arts on performing artists, not on arts institutions in the first instance. This isn't an issue that touches on areas of sort of profound social polarization, but it is controversial in the arts. You know, there are real debates about whether artists require institutions or institutions require artists. There are real debates about the way artists are supported within the institutional landscape and whether that support is either effective or just, depending on the nature of the debate. And so by at least saying we're going to focus on artists, you know, we are adding layers to that discussion that tend to put artists in the center. I think another example is, you know, we're very significant funders of natural conservation, and really on behalf of plant and animal species. That's what Doris Duke really cared about, was the protection, restoration, and preservation of plant and animal species. You know, we're in a moment where, on the one hand, you know, that work might feel incredibly conducive to efforts across the society to address climate change. But the reality is that there are many people in those debates who think it's actually very difficult to address the climate, protect all people, and protect nature at the same time. So again, by saying we're going to look for solutions that work for all three of those challenges, of people leading you know, prosperous, healthy, equitable lives, of being able to address climate change, and then ultimately of supporting nature for its own sake, you know, that again adds a degree of richness and difference to these sorts of discussions. You know, I do think that as a strategic matter, the last thing I'll say is I find that as a result of, or as a function of, foundations expressing the kind of the partial interests of their founders, we often do our best work by supporting voices that are being left out. Sometimes those voices are being left out as a result of, or as part of, historical structures of marginalization and oppression. Sometimes they're being left out because they're just not the popular view in a particular topic. But again, as a matter of capital efficiency, I don't think we actually do our best work when we're funding the same things that capital allocators at scale, government or the private sector, are investing in. We're usually doing our best work when we're adding in or providing a space for voices, ideas, concepts that aren't necessarily attracting that level of attention. We don't often call that pluralism and supporting pluralism, but it has the net effect of sort of increasing the amplitude of ideas on the table in society.
No, thank you, Aisha and Sam. Aisha, your note around pluralism is as aspirational, I think is deeply powerful, and kind of centering that on whether or not we have a shared social construct is very powerful. And then I think with Sam, understanding kind of the first, I think the natural prescription that comes with philanthropy, right? Donor interest. But then what does that look like, in practice and in play? And where does it evolve into in terms of like the how we give? So I just want to appreciate both of y'all for continuing this introduction to the conversation. Now let's turn to that second question: what pluralism shouldn't be. In other words, we know that pluralism as a value has come under increased scrutiny and challenge in the sector. In that, if pursued in a certain way, it can bring about harm. Lori, could you first tell us how you see pluralism showing up in your work at PRE, the philanthropic initiative for racial equity, and what is your sense of the dangers of the pursuit of pluralism in the charitable and philanthropic giving space? And then we'll bring Sam and Aisha back in. So first, you, Lori.
Thank you, Tanae, and appreciate the Chronicle and Urban Institute and fellow panelists. It's interesting because what we've just heard, I think, is part of what can be the danger of pluralism. There's so many interpretations. It's got so much vagueness. We've heard it, and we see it in being used in ways that can both be viewed as a goal and as a means. And I think those are very different things. And there's some danger in assuming that we are in a place where it can be a goal and a means that can be often very ahistoric, that is not recognizing some of the extreme, damaging, dehumanizing forces that we have right now. And as a response to polarization, to jump to pluralism in a way can be premature universalism. It can be assuming that we have those shared values. It can be assuming that we have those shared forces, that it's both the reason people think it's both sidesism, because it does leave that breadth of, well, if all values and all perspectives are valued, that there isn't something to be fighting for in terms of justice. And I will say very specifically for PRE, one of the dangers is we are seeing pluralism as a means without clarity on how that means in this moment in time, when we've got one side of the conversation trying to stop conversation around history, when people will say we want to acknowledge our shared history, we want to acknowledge, we want to look towards racial healing. I don't know how we can acknowledge our shared history when we've got people who are trying to suppress it. I don't know how we can move towards racial healing when we've got people who are trying to deny that any racial harm even exists. And I will say beyond race, of course, we know that intersectionally, we're seeing complete dehumanization of many transgender folks, others in the LGBT issues. And so I do want to clarify that for PRE, we are not talking only about race, we are talking about racial equity and other injustices that may not be reached by pluralism, but also pluralism as a means, but also really importantly, and I think we'll talk about this as we go on further, that pushing for pluralism, and particularly philanthropy pushing for pluralism as a means, ends up often speaking to the one side that mainstream and liberal philanthropy have actual influence over. And so you're getting those who are on the left often, who are fighting for justice, getting the message and the signal to be in many ways either sort of silencing their messages, don't be so radical, don't make the other side so uncomfortable, we're going to lose them. And not necessarily reaching the forces who are actually driving polarization.
No, thank you, Lori. What I also heard you say was if all the things are important, if all the things are valued, which they are and to some degree, but where's the alignment with justice in that? And so there is some note around that.
If I could just add one quick thing on the question of pluralism that Ben brought up in the beginning about the question of who should be funding what, I want to clarify that for Pri and many of us, and I know Frontlines as well, we are talking to those funders who actually are seeking to change towards racial equity and racial justice and trying to focus on here's the picture of reality. Here's the data that is based on all giving for us with our work with Candid. But when we're talking about the solutions, we are already talking to an audience that claims they want to be in a certain place. And so when we talk about being prescriptive, we're saying you already claim these values. We're going to say that this is in fact how we're seeing it be effectively reached.
No, thank you, Lori, for that clarification. How about you, Sam? How do you understand the critique? And Aisha, I'll come to you around this same question as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I share a lot of what Lori said in many respects. There might be some places where I think I might take a slightly different view, and I'll articulate both and see whether that's accurate. I think, I do think that we often invoke pluralism within in the abstract as if society is a set of political equals who are mostly negotiating between preferences. And we know that the reality historically is that not everyone is a political equal. And some of the things we're debating about aren't preferences. They're very conditions of our individual existence. So like the most obvious and most significant axis of this is race, which remains an incredibly socially salient category for assigning and determining and distributing the most fundamental forms of advantage within this society. And so I think you do want to be careful and I think it's important to be sensitive to people who say, saying we need to create space for all views is forcing me to be complicit in the conditions of my own oppression, historically or presently or both. I do think, though, there is a difference between pluralism, between the idea that it is that people that individual or group conscience can be voiced and compromise. Now, one of the conclusions that people can draw in the presence of pluralistic conditions are we need to make compromises to get things done, but that's a contingent decision. And you can make that decision about one set of issues and not about another set of issues. So just at Doris Duke Foundation, for example, we are much more ecumenical about investing in certain kinds of climate mitigating measures on the land than some people who work to mitigate climate change. We don't embrace, what we would consider climate denialism, and we don't work with people who we think are espousing climate denialism. We don't deny the right for that belief to be articulated, if that's what someone really believes. But there's an example where the forbearance of pluralism isn't the same thing as advocating compromise. I think the other area that I think can be tricky and is a danger kind of moving in the other direction is that there are some values that aren't dispositive in and of themselves. And again, to be focused on race, which is really sort of the most divisive social axis, certainly in this country, we think of at Doris Duke Foundation of equity as both a value and a vector, right? It's a lens. It calls on you to approach issues in a particular way. It doesn't settle exactly how you should necessarily approach those issues. So, for example, we are incredibly focused in our work I'm just to use the conservation example again because it's concrete. We're really focused on investing in efforts to promote natural conservation that also promote equity. Well, there's a lot of debate about how to do that. Does that mean that you should be focused on conservation in urban areas? Does it mean that where there are significant concentrations of affronts to equity to be addressed? Does it mean that you should be focused on conservation led by indigenous communities for whom dispossession and expropriation took the form of the mainstream conservation movement in many cases? I mean, these questions just aren't answered. A similar example that you could think of is there are many people, for example, who agree that police accountability is a significant issue to reduce racially disparate violence. But how exactly to implement police accountability is a topic of significant debate among people who otherwise share the same values. So I think these are actually examples where the danger is thinking that the value actually erodes an underlying level of potential pluralism about how to implement the value. And my view is, like, to actually implement the value, you've got to create some space for that discussion and that debate.
Aisha.
Yeah, so, I'll note there's a robust ecosystem, and a wide range of philanthropic actors testing a variety of strategies. There is plenty of room for disagreement within this paradigm, right? I'll give an example from some of my previous work in regional philanthropy, something I see playing out in regional foundations across the country, namely the push and pull between direct service work and funding systems change work, right? So I have been extremely excited to see a number of funders, particularly regional funders, because it is something that's typically reserved for national funders. So see a bunch of regional and local funders embrace funding systems change work. And I'm very proud of that. And at the same time, I also vigorously support direct service work. I believe that we must both, work towards changing the system that denies, access to women to adequate healthcare, for example, while at the same time making sure that the 12-year-old assault survivor has the adequate healthcare that she needs in this very moment right now today. And so both of those things, I think, can coexist and are often presented as a paradigm. One's better than the other, or you must do one or the other, right? But at the same time, I really believe that I can't accept a notion of pluralism that has that basis, again, of that social contract that denies the humanity of a number of people, right? And so where we get into what pluralism or this concept cannot or should not be, if it involves the denial of the humanity of Black people, of women seeking healthcare, of queer and trans folks, of dreamers, of Palestinians being murdered in Palestine and starved in Palestine, if it denies the humanity of poor working people trying to get by and figuring out what it means to support their children, if it means that my children are denied the right to learn their own history and then forced to internalize lies about yours, that cannot be the basis of a shared social contract by which we pursue pluralism. And so I think those are the things that I worry about and I think are extremely dangerous. And I think we are in denial about when we talk about philanthropic institutions being actors in those spaces, right? And so just as Lori spoke about, we almost, in many ways, we're talking about kind of racial equity being this hot button moment around pluralism, but we're not really focused on the number of actors in the sphere, including the philanthropic sphere, that are actively supporting work and initiatives that deny people the right to have their truth or honesty shared in the public sphere.
No, thank you, Aisha. And we're headed right there. So we're headed right there. And, recent debates about exactly what you're talking about in terms of how are we centering and supporting kind of a host of different forms of prescription, and what does that look like? But more specifically, there's a rising tension with the drive to support racial equity in giving. But we also know from Ben's paper that some of the early champions of racial equity giving did so in the name of pluralism. So it's clearly a complicated relationship, and you and Sam have noted the complications in that. So Hillary, we're going to bring you back. How do you see charitable and philanthropic pluralism in relationship to a commitment to equity? And maybe that's building on Aisha and Sam's points, or some divergent points that you may want to note.
Well, I think this is the core thing, right? This is the unfinished work of America. And to my mind, we are really in a dangerous place. I think one of the biggest, most dangerous effects of our current kind of polarization is how it's succeeding in weaponizing identities against each other, right? By race or gender or class or, all the things, Aisha, that you spoke to, and discrediting things like DEI. So the first thing I would say is that philanthropy needs unequivocally to continue to embrace racial equity and especially racial equity, and to be smart about it. We can't allow ourselves to be manipulated or divided on this issue. And with credit to conversations with colleagues at the Heartland Foundation and others, I do think this is where bridging efforts, if poorly designed or not combined with other kinds of approaches, can exacerbate existing inequities or power dynamics and deflect attention away from structural injustice. So it's worrying when you hear that some funders are decreasing their investments in racial equity in order to increase their investments in bridging. Somehow we have to see these two things together and work on them together. And then I hate to say it, no, you would have to live under a rock, having been around anyone from the Ford Foundation for the last few years. But I think to do this work, it means we as funders, and Aisha, you also mentioned this, have to change how we work. We have to see that there are communities that have been chronically underfunded by philanthropy, and we need to choose for those communities. We need to choose for organizations that are led by BIPOC leaders, and we have to, we have got to stop giving one-year project grants because we can't do the work of equity without giving grantees who are closer to these issues than any of us will ever be the ability to have a longer window to plan, more confidence to be the first mover on an issue. And these are hard issues that are going to continue over time. So I think this very set of tensions that we're talking about that are real are even more argument for changing how we fund and encouraging more of us to do multi-year general operating supports, because we can't do the work on any of these contentious issues by starving grantees who are on the front lines.
Thank you, Hillary. Lori.
Thank you. So one of the issues is, what is philanthropy's role in advocating for pluralism? I mean, we're talking about philanthropic pluralism in terms of what approaches you each are able to take. And Sam, to some of your points, I think what Doris Duke decides in terms of its strategy, I don't know that our racial equity and racial justice advocates are saying you can't do what you do. We're suggesting here's what we are hearing from communities that are most impacted is most effective if you're trying to get to this point. And what we're seeing, whether it's intended or not, and I see that it's coming up in one of the questions in the Q&A that we'll get to in a bit, is we are getting organizations who are getting direct feedback from philanthropy that the racial justice approaches are too polarizing. They're getting this message, and they're getting the counter reinforcement that pluralism is the way to go. And part of the reality is we do have some work to do on both sides in terms of those of us who are focused on racial and social justice, recognize that there are dynamics that we want to strengthen. Many will know Maurice Mitchell's excellent paper outlining a number of the challenges. The issue is, where's philanthropy's role in that? Philanthropy coming into this very nuanced conversation that is among movement based on integrity and accountability and relationship building, now getting basically interfered with in many cases by philanthropy's messages that, like, yes, we think you're being too divisive. This is too extreme. This is too focused on your identity, isn't actually following some of the principles that they're saying at the same time, that we should be listening to those most impacted, that we should be focusing on building power about those most impacted. Because I have to say, I'm not hearing the calls for pluralism coming from community organizers, base builders, and those who work most closely. It's coming so much more often from those who, frankly, are a little bit more comfortable with the status quo. And that should probably raise some alarms to some of us.
No, thank you, Lori. I'm actually going to go to Brian, and then I'm going to go to Aisha for this next question. We heard from Ben about the rise of cost prescription, which is what I think we are building toward in this conversation, about the increased willingness of some within the charitable sector to insist certain causes are more worthy or in more urgent need of support than others. Brian, do you view this prescriptive turn to be a direct challenge to pluralism, or is it compatible with it? What are your thoughts there?
Well, there's so much that's already happened in this conversation that I'd love to jump in on, and I think this question
feel
gives
free
me a chance to do that, because I think that the point that Aisha made is so important, that we have to view pluralism as an ideal, an aspiration, I think was the language that you used, Aisha. And the fact that we don't live in that ideal, that we haven't come close to reaching that ideal, I think is critical to point out. To me, though, that's not a reason to reject the ideal. That's a reason to do much better towards trying to achieve that ideal. And I think the conversation that we just had is a good illustration of different ways and different ideas for how to do that. And so when it comes to this idea of prescription, I'm all for prescription. I think it's really important that people have very strongly held convictions, and that they show up with the courage of those convictions and are able to make a strong case why what they believe is going to be the best way to help people to live better lives. But I think prescription, the idea that people can do that, it presupposes pluralism. Because if we don't have an expectation that any person should be able to show up and challenge the status quo and make the case that we're doing things wrong and we need to do them better, then none of this is possible. And so I think a lot of this is a matter of language. And I think it's really important that we're clear in our language, because it helps us to coordinate our work and have the kind of disagreements that produce learning and knowledge and better approaches. But to me, this is a strong case for pluralism. The question that I find when pluralism is challenged as a framework, which is different from challenging the way that pluralism is practiced today. But the challenge that I have when people say not pluralism is then what? And if you're going to propose an alternative to pluralism, the key question to me is who chooses? Who gets to set the agenda and tell everybody else that what they're doing is not just not right, but is not allowed? And to me, that's the danger, and that's what we are seeing in so many of our other institutions, that people say it's not okay for you to be wrong. You just can't do it. And to me, that's a downward spiral in our society that we don't want to entertain. We don't want to go down that path. But it's very different from sort of pluralism as a comfort with the status quo or comfort with the way that things are going on. In fact, to my mind, it's exactly the opposite. Pluralism is the system that enables those people who have ideas that challenge the way that things are to have standing. And that's not by any stretch to say that that is the way that things are or have been, but it is to say that that is the way that things should be, And as a society, or as an institution in society, philanthropy, we have an opportunity to help move society more towards that ideal.
Aisha, do you want to respond?
Yeah, well, maybe not respond, but directly to Brian.
Lovingly.
Yes, absolutely. I have so many thoughts and points that I would like to make. I think there's a few things for me. I think I am somewhat challenged by this idea of philanthropy being the norm keeping institution that is inviting in the concept of pluralism, right? In many ways, I see philanthropy is almost satiric to use those two concepts together and thinking about philanthropy and pluralism. Namely, when we think about philanthropy as a power holding and resource holding institution, I remember when the op-ed or piece came out that many of your foundations participated in, and at that time, just coincidentally, it was the Association of Black Foundation Executives. It was our national conference, and so many of us were at that conference. And I remember it having, both a chilling effect, and people maybe perceived it as harmful, and there was deep discussion about it in many rooms and at many cocktail tables and many round tables privately, right? But the way that power functions is that those same critiques did not happen in the public sphere, right? And they came from certain folks in institutions, but not many in our own institution. And so I think that's the opposite in the thing that we don't want to have happen. We're talking about pluralism. So when power and resources function in this way and kind of centering ourselves in this conversation of polarity, it's interesting to see that what we have done is effectively silence, other institutions that have other opinions and have critiques. And I think part of, the idea of pluralism is to invite critique. And I want to be clear that I also don't think that this all means that you have to be adversarial with those who you disagree with, or you see as opponents to, in my case, racial equity and justice. In my opinion, and some of my best friends and favorite colleagues may disagree with me, but I don't think it's productive to be adversarial at all, mainly because it's not worth it, right? I don't want to spin my wheels trying to convince people who are committed to misunderstanding me. I think we often put too much of our energy towards those that we see as, as opposition to our work, as opposed to putting all of our energy and focus on organizing the people who are aligned with us. The other thing that I'll name, and I know this is something that Lori would likely agree with in her work, in terms of this idea of being prescriptive, being a direct challenge, and racial equity or equity is being kind of centered again in this conversation. And again, I do not see racial equity or equity as a issue, right? An issue area that funders should be supporting. I see it as a lens. I see it as actual factual data, right? And so, the denial or not using that lens across many and most issues is not approaching the work with fact. It's a denial of fact, whether willful or otherwise. And so I don't know that it being prescriptive is the most important challenge that we should focus on as a sector, as we talk about this concept of polarity. I think there are a number of things that are happening within our sector that are blocking people's participation in the public square, and I think we should focus there as opposed to whether or not we being prescriptive is the ultimate challenge, and particularly centering racial equity or equity in that work or in that critique.
Well, I love this conversation, and I think all of us, Aisha, I was at that APSI meeting. I definitely remember the buzz in the room when the article came about. So thank you for lifting that space up, and Brian, thank you for lifting up the comments around, if not pluralism, then what? What are we doing here, and what does that mean, and who chooses? I want to invite the virtual participants into this space with us, and I'm going to start asking just a couple of questions that are coming from the room. And I'm definitely mindful of time, and I want to get as many as I can answered and responded to. So feel free for everyone to come in. Ben, are you rejoining us for this part of the conversation? I see you. Yay, good. Ben's back on. So I'll put out a question and just ask you all to respond, and I'll try to keep us on time because I want you all to have a little bit of time at the end with any closing thoughts. So our first question is, if we're encouraging pluralism in philanthropy and communities coming together to solve problems, how can we ensure the average person's voice is heard? I would love, do you want me to direct that one, or does someone want to weigh in? Brian?
I'll start us off, but I'm sure others here have thought about this as well. I think one answer is to show that when unexpected voices, I won't use the language of average, I think when voices that are not usually part of the conversation do get voiced and do have the support of philanthropy behind it, it usually works better than the standard way of addressing a problem. And so I think that one of the best ways that we can help to ensure that philanthropy does a better job of bringing in unexpected voices or voices that haven't typically been part of the conversation about how to solve problems is to show that it works. I'll give you just a very quick example. We support some groups in addiction recovery, given the magnitude of the problem these days. For a long time, the norm in addiction recovery were expensive clinics that have about a 45% efficacy rate. And the standard in this field was just that's about as good as we're going to do. So let's continue to kind of innovate at the margin there, but not really look for disruption. We were very fortunate to meet an organization that's led by a gentleman who suffered from substance abuse disorder for about a decade, built a group called the Phoenix, and does things completely different than the typical clinical approach. For the past 11 years or so, Scott Strode has done this, and his efficacy rate is 85%. So putting resources behind a guy like Scott, in this case, what you might call an unexpected voice, or somebody certainly who typical sort of expert-driven philanthropy wouldn't have looked to as the source of the solution, and then illuminating that and saying, hey, look at how well he's done relative to all of these other programs. To me, the hope there is not just that more people will fund Scott, but more people will take that lesson, that we do better at solving problems when we bring in voices that aren't typically resourced and aren't typically sort of the dominant. I mean, we're all in philanthropy for a reason, right? There are problems that have not been solved. If we continue to invest in the way that we've always done them, it stands to reason that we will not solve these problems. And so I think that there is a way that we can help to lift up those voices that haven't typically been part of it. And part of that is just doing it and showing that it works.
No, I appreciate that, Brian. There's a mantra that I just heard that I think we probably all heard, which is not for us, if not without us kind of messaging. I hope I said that right, but it really is this notion of we actually can't do this without the voices that we that need to be in the room are centered. So thank you for that. I'm going to move us to another question, and I love that they use this, so I'm going to read it verbatim. How does all this jive with donor choice? donor intention, and how might pluralism, with this promotion of many causes to give, contribute to donor fatigue when donors are not able to decide among the many options? Hillary, do you want to weigh in there?
Sure. I mean, I think that's one of the hardest things about philanthropy, right? It will remain true that donors choose what they focus on, and that's why I think we need more. We need to do more to empower grantees around these issues of accountability and journalism. You know, because we will not. You know, you can take the ability to act across a variety of issues and justify not having an impact for years and years and years. And so I think we need a much more rigorous way to look at whether the privilege we have of choosing the issues that we work on causes us to deserve the benefits we get from the tax code and others. You know, that it has to add up to something that moves society forward for the common good. It can't just be defined by the preference of the donor. But I don't think that that's an easy thing for philanthropy to do itself. I think we need, again, critique from journalisms. We need mechanisms that give grantees the ability to hold us to account. We need much more transparent systems of data that let people know what we do with the resources that we've got. And that's not to put the burden outside ourselves. We also have to be accountable. But I don't think you can have the degree of choice we have without some kind of accountability.
No, I think we can all appreciate that in the work that we do. And I'm sure folks that are grant seekers also will appreciate that level of transparency.
I mean, I think also just to add to Hillary's response, I mean, I think it's really important to take account of the extraordinary advantage that we accord to philanthropic resources, right? Like we've been mounting these sort of negative and positive arguments, again, to go back to Ben's framework. The negative argument is, you know, it's I should be able to act upon my own conscience. And the positive argument's a prudential argument. It just says the society will be better off if there's lots and lots of different views. We accord the tax code advantages because of the prudential argument. If we think the prudential argument isn't being fulfilled, we can take those tax advantages away without changing anything about the ability for individuals within the polity to be able to express their own interests, so, or to speak their own consciences. Those are two really different things. And I think Hillary's right. I think it's falsifiable. You could say that this actually is doing the work that we want it to do in this period, but it's not doing it in another period, and we're going to change the structure. In fact, you know, the 5% distribution requirement is the result of one of those moments in which we looked into this form of capital allocation and aggregation and said, you know, we don't actually think it's doing the job that it was meant to do, and so we're going to change the rules under which it operates.
If I may, just one little piece. I think about this concept of donor choice very similar to the way that I think about the work that I do with foundations and wealthy individuals and strategists around racial equity and racial justice, right? So if you're looking for me to provide you with a checklist, or for Frontline to provide you with a checklist, and like you'll know when it's there, when you've done it, when you just go through this checklist and you check it off, that is never going to happen, and it's not actually the hope or the goal, right? What we actually need from folks is a mind shift, a norm shift, right? We all have been socialized to think about this world and consider this world through a dominant frame, people of color included, right? And so the shift that I, look for in donors is that same way. And I hope that we as an institution are helping to, remake the norms by which donors operate. And that's not really about being prescriptive and telling folks how to give or what they should be giving, but actually helping people think through a different frame, or like, what are the questions that we are asking of ourselves and of our institutions that are shaping the way we give and who we give to.
Can I jump in quick on the question of donor fatigue? So I say this with no background in fundraising, but if pluralism is defined, at least as I see it, not in terms of just the sheer magnitude of numbers of causes or organizations that one can give to. That's not pluralism. Pluralism relates to the amplitude, the difference between them. And so, if there are many different ways of approaching a problem, and they are able to articulate their rationales and their the reasons for pursuing those different approaches, I think that can only that would seem to me to be important for actually driving donor choice and allowing people to understand why some views or some approaches are more effective than others. I think that if there is a danger for donor fatigue, it's with sheer numbers of approaches that aren't actually unique and exceptional and can't define what they do. And so I think in that case, there is a kind of slippage between just increasing the number of organizations out there and that is an inherent good in of itself, which I don't think is the case. But having a wide range of approaches that people that have to justify and legitimate themselves, that to me is a valuable addition.
If I could just,
please, Lori, go ahead. Go right ahead.
The question of donor intent and donor choice is one conversation. I mean, I feel like we're having multiple conversations here. And so I think that one of the questions we didn't get to was about trying to clarify our focus. And I want to clarify that for many of us and for many who reacted to the op-ed and for much of the work that we're doing, and frankly, why I'm here today, is because there is a reaction right now that's happening in the field because of the strong influence of funders advancing pluralism as a means. I think it's a bit of a false debate that there's a big conversation going on and a lot of people focused on attacking pluralism as an ideal or even pluralism as an approach in terms of the array of things you can fund. Again, I'm not saying there aren't some of us who say there's things that are more effective if this in fact is your goal. But the push from funders as pluralism as a means is definitely being directly received as counter to things that we have seen and tried to position as being effective in terms of racial justice approaches. So earlier when Brian said, well, what's the alternative? I think the alternative is that you need to work through racial justice and achieve racial justice before you can get to some level of this ideal of pluralism. And I think funders who are seeking to do that need to question what signals are being received by the field.
Thank you all. What I'd like to say, there's a host of questions that are in our waiting lineup right here to be asked, and the panelists will have access to all these questions after this event. But we are very mindful of time. We know everyone has a busy day, and today is Monday. So with that, I'm actually going to ask each one of our panelists to leave us with a takeaway from today's conversation. And if you want to draw from the questions that are in the room, feel free to. But we'll just ask that you take about 30 seconds or so to leave us with any lasting thoughts from today's conversation. We'll start with you, Hillary.
I think we have to make sure we don't use pluralism as an excuse. There are major inequities that are facing our society. One of the reasons that we see the challenges we do is that there's a kind of inequality that is corrosive of hope. And so I think to make sure we hold in the frame the racial justice, the equity justice issues, and don't let philanthropy off the hook for the need to work on them is really critical. So any of the, for the strands that would say that pluralism is a reason or an excuse not to do that, or that you can or should do one without the other, I think we have to reject that proposition. And thank you for having this conversation.
No, thank you. Brian, what's the takeaway from today's conversation, or something you want to leave for the room?
Well, I guess my takeaway is that I'm optimistic that we can make progress on all of the very hard issues that were brought up and many that we didn't discuss. through a common commitment to being open to hearing different ways of doing things. And I didn't hear a challenge to that notion. And so I actually walk away with a more optimistic sense than not. I will just say this, to my mind, we are deeply committed to the notion that progress will only come when we challenge the dominant way of thinking about things and are open to bringing new ideas onto the field. My reading of history is basically it's a series of discovering that a lot of what we were very firmly convicted in turned out to be wrong. And when you think about the progress that's been made in medical science, the progress that's been made in physics, the progress that's been made in agriculture, and indeed the progress that's been made in society, it is continually striving to do better. And if we're going to do that, we have to have a commitment to the moral dignity of every person and sort of an affirmative push to bring new ideas onto the table. And to me, that's rooted in a commitment to liberalism and pluralism.
Thank you. Lori, what are your takeaways from today?
Yeah, I think there's a danger. I think I started with this in terms of the vagueness of pluralism. I think there's also a danger in acting like the abstract of this discussion is the reality for what is playing out in so many of communities and so many of the nonprofit organizations that have been really fighting the good fight that we did have some increased attention to and some capacity being built that is being directly threatened, not just by, again, the resources pulling away, but by the signaling that somehow their message is wrong. And we've got it in a way that is at the most critical time when we are facing this extreme threat of authoritarianism, that it's dangerous to pretend that it's an abstract theoretical conversation. It's real life for a lot of people. And I think that trying to focus on what is the direct message here, what is the direct meaning, and not get lost in the, well, we all agree that pluralism sounds a little bit like this or that, is a critical thing to do in this moment, and get it away from being a potential diversionary tactic. So thank you.
Thank you. Sam?
Sure. I mean, I would just offer the observation that sort of whatever word you use for it, most of the organizations and individuals that we support and work with in areas like the performing arts or natural conservation or medical research share a lot of beliefs about the most important problems in their fields or in the society, but individually tend to take almost iconoclastic views about exactly how to solve those problems. And we think that's socially useful.
Thank you. And we'll close with Aisha.
I think one of the things that I'm left here with is that, vague calls for civility often lead to silencing, right? And this conversation is coming in many ways at a time where we're seeing the most pluralistic, equitable, and just visions of philanthropy that have ever existed. And so I just call us all as a sector to be mindful of what we can both give power to and what we can take power away from. And the last thing I'll name is, just as we've seen on this call, I think that in many ways, America is not as divided as many actors would have us think, right? And so we have to find the things that we find in common that are important, and put our attention and resources towards those things to advance equity and justice.
I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. I would like to send a thank you to our co-host Stacy and the team at the Chronicle of Philanthropy for co-hosting this conversation with us today. Aisha, Sam, Lori, Brian, Hillary, I just want to thank you all for sharing your thoughts and perspectives to our audience today. Ben, we just really appreciate this body of work that has helped to bridge us today. So I really want to thank you for your thought leadership, and to the Urban team for helping us. And of course, to each of the audience members who took the time out to participate today. So on behalf of the Urban Institute, I want to say thank you for your time and have a wonderful week.
Thank you all.
Thank you.